In Soviet Russia... Wait, shit, wrong time period. Yeah, Chechen Wars. Привет! И добрая особенность история. Can't fault the man for trying. Featuring the Chechen Wars. We've all heard of the US's many run-ins with Islamic extremism and egregious insurgencies throughout the late 20th to early 21st century, but you might not be familiar with Russia's own experiences of these sorts. Russia has faced off against these types numerous times before, starting with the Soviet-Afghan War of the 80s, and continuing through wars such as the Tajikistani Civil War and the Chechen Wars, and it continues up to today with Russia's involvement in the Syrian Civil War. For today's episode, I'll be focusing on the Chechen Wars, the deep-rooted causes, the series of events that led it to become a modern war of Islamic extremism, and how it has shaped Russia and the world's image today. First off, I think it would be useful if we started at square one and attempted to shape an understanding of who the Chechens are. We won't go too far back, we'll just start in 10,000 BC, I think that's good. From 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC, the Nak peoples migrated to the slopes of the Caucasus, located to the west of the Caspian Sea. The modern-day Chechens, or in their native tongue Nakchi, are close descendants of these peoples. They were just about entirely separate from the eastern Slavs that birthed the early Russian chiefdoms. They lived mostly as mountainous tribes and remained fairly secluded from centers of technology and civilization. By the time the 1720s rolled along, they were under Persian rule. But Peter the Great's ambitious campaign saw the Russians brought to the Caucasus in the Russo-Persian War. The Russians won their war with the Persians, but did not rule the lands for very long, only about 9 to 12 years. Despite this, Russian claims to the Caucasus began in this victory. Throughout a large part of the 18th century, the Russians continued their struggles with the Islamic empires over the Caucasus. They viewed the mountain range as strategically advantageous in future campaigns against the Persians and Ottomans, and so under the guise of spreading Christianity, pushed even further into the Caucasus. Their interactions with the natives were not exactly courteous either, and hostilities between the mountain tribes and the imperialist Russians became well cemented. The Nak people also began to widely accept Islam as a way to oppose the Orthodox Russians. As the decades passed, many Caucasian wars would be waged, and it wouldn't be until the 1860s that the flame of war would begin to smolder. The Russians offered those who flee to the Ottomans' domain mercy, and so 80% would accept exodus, and those who remained were to fight a never-ending guerrilla war. The Caucasus were akin to the US's Wild West, and the mountain tribes became viewed as bands of bandits by those who attempted to colonize the region. The tribes, throughout their shared struggle with the Russians, began to feel a unified bond, helping concentrate them into larger republics such as the Ingushetia, Dagestan, and of course, Chechnya. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, followed by the Civil War, the republics saw their chance and declared independence. Many frowned upon this, but with being locked in constant battle, they were incapable of stomping them out. It wasn't until 1921, with the Bolshevik victory imminent, that Russians would return to the Caucasus and see the governments ousted. Under Stalin's rule, the people were discontent, and many attempted to see the dream of 1917 independence restored. Stalin, arrogant as he was, believed he would be the one to finally break the Chechen people. The Chechens were rounded up and exiled to the deserts of the Kazakh region in 1944. Those who could not be transported were systematically slaughtered. 60% of Chechens and other Caucasian people perished in their personal equivalent of the Holocaust. Stalin began his plan to convert the outlands of the Caucasus into a Soviet wonderland, and would make Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, the gem of this new process of Russification. With the Chechens gone, the city was populated by ethnic Russians who spoke, acted, and worked like Russians. It wasn't until 3 years after Stalin's death, in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev would permit the returning of the Chechen people to Chechnya. Upon their return, though, the Chechens saw their language and culture actively suppressed. Speaking Russian was required, and those that spoke the Chechen language in public were brought before a Soviet officer for some gentle correction. Moving forward to 1991, the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev saw its last days, and by Christmas the Soviet Union split into 15 new states, the dominant region being the Russian Federation we have today. The Chechens were under the belief they would finally realize independence, and so declared themselves as the independent Chechen Republic. Few, if any, recognized them. Officially, they were a part of the Federation. Johar Jadayev assumed leadership before the charmed Chechens as the first president of the Chechen Republic on the 9th of November 1991. He was an eccentric character, constantly preaching the destiny of the Chechen people. He also sought to extend his passion of firearms into the policy of the Chechen state, and Chechnya would soon become a hotbed of illegal arms dealing.
Да. $150? Одноразовая противотанковая граната. А это что? Это АК-74. Это АК-74. Сколько он стоит? Он ничего не стоит, бесплатно России дает. А он стреляет? $50, конечно. А ну-ка один раз, может быть, стрелим?
Whilst Chechnya did attract adventurers and criminals for its exotic ways, it was far from a functioning state. The government was maladjusted, civil services were non-existent, and law enforcement was a joke. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the new Russia, sought to end the Chechens' adventure with independence and cut off the power and other vital resources heading to Chechnya. Without these modern necessities, the state began to crumble. The republic was reduced to a gathering of the armed disgruntled, and soon talks of coups against Chadaev were in the air. Yeltsin wished to see a Russian sympathizing Chechen take power of the state, so in November 1994, Yeltsin had Russian soldiers posing as mercenaries backing anti-Chadaev fighters move into Grozny. Chadaev was able to fight back and defeat his opponents and brought Yeltsin much shame when he flaunted the mercenaries on national television. Yeltsin in response deemed it was time to stop beating around the proverbial bush, and so the Kremlin readied 40,000 Federation troops to invade Chechnya on the 11th of December 1994. Yeltsin claimed his goal was to deal with the bandits and traitors of the area, and that this was not in fact a war against Chechens. But if there was one thing the people of Chechnya hated more than Chadaev, it was Russians. Yeltsin's army was ill prepared for this sudden offensive, which caused them to employ the brilliant strategy of moving in 3 armoured columns with no infantry or air cover straight towards a city which boasted markets that overflowed with anti-armour and grenade-based weaponry. Intense fighting erupted, and only one of the 3 columns would even reach Grozny. The war had begun with the slaughter of Federation troops, Chechen fighters, and the many civilians caught in the crossfire. After the catastrophe that was the first wannabe blitzkrieg, tables were flipped and plans were redrawn for a new offensive that would be commenced on New Year's Day 1995. It seems no matter how much they redrew their plans though, they were incapable of realizing that armor was not, in fact, invincible. Russian conscripts were sent to the slaughter by being shoved into a tin can, slowly driven into the heart of Chechnya, and then being burnt alive by the first Chechen fighter to spot them. The generals back at Moscow exclaimed "to hell with it" and engaged the well-tested strategy of aiming every cannon at something and firing every minute of every day. Grozny was bombarded with non-stop artillery for weeks on end until on the 19th of January 1995 the Chechen commander, Aslan Maskhadov, ordered that his fighters leave this bloodbath, and so it was done. They left the demoralized Russian troops to stumble into the city of rubble and claim victory in the Battle of Grozny. The Chechens might have lost the battle, but they too had old familiar tactics to resort to, and they began to set up in the mountains they had fought on for centuries. They were ready to begin what would become an arduous guerrilla war. The fighters had no mercy in their attacks on Russian outposts and convoys, and the war would become far more a psychological affair than it was strategical. Taliban and former Mujahideen also began to move into the war zone in an attempt to wage a jihad against the Russians. What these jihads lacked in numbers, they offered in money, and soon the wealthiest Chechen fighters would just so happen to be radical Muslims. As the war dragged on throughout the months, the Russians had been making small Pyrrhic victories against the Chechens, working them into a corner. The Chechens were ready to lash out like they hadn't done before. In what would be dubbed the Budzhinovsk hospital hostage crisis, Chechen rebels led by Shamil Basayev overran a hospital and took hostage 1,700 people in the Russian city of Budzhinovsk. It led to a standoff between the terrorists and the Russian army, which would prompt Basayev to make his demands for a ceasefire to be signed. The restless amongst the Federation troops ordered that the hospital be stormed and no Chechens spared. At least 140 hostages were killed, and the Chechens were able to hold their position and the rest of the hostages. The attack had failed, and the public had lost faith. A compromise was made, and so Basayev got his ceasefire and his safe return to Chechnya. Chadaev used his time to reconcile his field commanders and rally his people. He addressed the Chechens, prophesizing that Grozny's occupation would soon end and that those who would refuse to leave would be struck down by the Chechens. It soon became clear though that the only one to be struck down would be Chadaev. As for his threats, he was targeted and killed by a Russian laser-guided missile on the 21st of April 1996. His death would be announced on national television by none other than Shamil Basayev. It was clear the ceasefire at this point was no more than a piece of paper, and the Chechens would need to act fast as the Russian troops began to move into the mountains. They avoided engaging their pursuers and attacked the weakened Federation garrison in Grozny, managing to successfully take back the city and break the Russian people's will. Those who were not dead were sick to death of this fighting, and the Kasayot occurred would be agreed upon on the 31st of August 1996. It meant the Russian forces would have to withdraw by December, and that the Chechens would remain in their legal limbo of quasi-independence while still remaining de jure-wise a part of Russia. Aslan Maskhadov took head of the Chechen Republic. He had secured his people peace, but nothing more. The country was nothing short of devastated. As a Chechen, your residence most likely had several craters in it, your family significantly smaller, and your mental state severely shaken. Maskhadov also had no way of rebuilding this republic of rubble. Only the Taliban recognized their independence and was willing to deal with them, while other countries turned the other cheek. Chechnya was completely isolated. As always, with no resources and no enemy, the people began to splinter. The field commanders became warlords. They all formed their own factions with their own men, territory, and agendas. Chechnya would also see flocks of Islamic extremists arrive in the country. Majority of Chechens are Sufi Muslims, one of the relatively more peaceful sects of Islam. But as Wahhabist Sunnis arrived with Saudi dollar to boast, many young men would convert and join these militias. In 1998, the Wahhabist militants had become so powerful they were able to force the secular Maskhadov to instate Sharia law. He had no control over the warlords and their militias anymore. By 1999, the Russian elections had come. The embarrassed Yeltsin had fallen ill, and so his replacement would have to take helm. In entered the young, strong-willed Vladimir Putin, who promised a restoration of Russian glory. He was just what the people wanted. The tumultuous Chechnya terrorized the Russians, and on the 2nd of August 1999, malcontent Chechen warlords launched an invasion into the neighbouring Russian province of Dagestan. Russian troops descended onto the situation and successfully combated the dishevelled insurgents. During this conflict, incidents of border clashes and bomb attacks peaked, and most Russians knew Chechen terror would have to be curbed soon. Some accused Putin, the former KGB agent, of orchestrating these attacks to rally the people against the Chechens once again. While it would stand to reason, no strong evidence such exists yet. Putin promised war, a better war, a successful war. He would state, "There is no border with Chechnya, the discussion is over." On the 26th of August 1999, a much larger and far more prepared Russian army moved to the Chechen border after cleaning up all resistance in Dagestan. Their war would begin with an all-out combined artillery and air bombardment on Chechnya. Putin had promised they would destroy terrorists in any place at any time. He stuck to his promise, but it would cost many Chechen civilian lives. Putin, though, had also prepared for the backlash, and so kept a tight grip around the media as to not allow images of this horrible war to spread. Despite Putin's actions seeming contemptible, he was able to garner a healthy amount of international support for his cause. It would explode with the World Trade Center attacks in the future, mind the horrific pun. It would cause many to give the thumbs up to Putin's war against Islamic terrorism. Only those in Chechnya saw this as a war against Chechens. In response to the Second War, many Chechens were not willing to stand and die anymore. 25% of the population fled, being forced from their home just like they had been in '44. By May 2000, Russia had defeated the Chechens in a conventional warfare sense, and had laid claim to Grozny. Yet again, the fighters would turn to the mountains and begin a campaign of terror within the Russian heartland. Shootings, bombings, and other terrorist escapades would be carried out in Moscow and other Russian cities, hoping to capture the success of the Budunovsk hospital hostage crisis. Shamil Basayev became Russia's most wanted man until his death on July 10, 2006, where his own weapons of terror literally blew up in his face. Putin was adamant that Russia would defeat the separatists, and the Russian people were behind him. Every attack only filled their hearts with anger and increased their love for Putin. Putin's run as the second president of Russia would end on the 7th of May 2008, and he would be succeeded by Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev wished to see work on downscaling the counter-terrorism operations in Chechnya in hopes of seeing the area rebuilt. The war would officially end on the 15th of April 2009 with a Russian victory. It may be the case that the war is over today, but the fighting has certainly not stopped. Many Chechens today are not willing to retire to defeat, and the unrelenting approach of Putin has only left them more radicalized and more desperate. Some Chechens have joined more current terrorist groups like ISIS in an attempt to continue fighting a jihad. Some continue to attempt to strike terror into the hearts of their sworn enemies, which can be seen in numerous terrorist attacks on Russian soil every year. Most importantly, Chechnya, ravaged by war, has become a nest of young hateful men for Islamic terror groups to draw upon. The Chechen Wars has helped define the burdens of contemporary Russia, and it is much the reason why Russian boys and men are willing to take up their Kalashnikovs and enter Syria. Because while it is obvious that Kremlin's interests in Syria are not moral-based, the people who will fight and die theirs are. Putin has made his voice quite clear on how he feels about these militants. He has seen them push Russia to its knees, and he saw what levels they are willing to stoop to keep themselves above water. Perhaps I'm ignorant, and Putin is playing a terribly convincing facade, but I truly believe Putin has not only a political interest in destroying these groups, but a personal one as well. No one honestly knows what the future has to hold, but by looking into our past and shaping an understanding of it, we can certainly get a better idea. Another fortnight, another video, right? Except I almost never actually get these out in a bi-weekly manner. Besides that, I'd like to thank all my patrons and yet again personally thank Zedfear, because I legally have to. I won't subject you to any kind of cringy Russian goodbye like I did for the intros, so instead just piss off.